Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started on this, our final session of the conference. And I'm delighted that we've got here today Frank Mattern and Senator Feingold. Frank Mattern, over the last period, has been working very closely with the German government on how to integrate the 1.5 million or so refugees that have come into Germany. All of you will recall that Mrs. Merkel, a couple of years ago, when faced with the problem of people, of an exodus of people from Syria and Iraq, said very simply, we can do this. And it provoked across Europe a huge debate that said, no, we can't. A debate which, in my view, ignored the fact that Europe and European governments some 80 years ago created millions of refugees who had to flee to the rest of the world, and countries in Europe that could have taken those refugees at the time and didn't have cause to pause and wonder why. And that 80% of the world's refugees flee to the very poorest countries in the world who have the very least capability to deal with them, and yet are, if we look at countries like Jordan with a couple of million refugees and struggling to meet the needs of those refugees. That's a backdrop, but against that backdrop we have the German example, and what has struck me is that the headlines were fast and furious in the British press when the refugees started arriving, with every possible negative, there's a kind of zero tolerance of even the slightest disruption that the refugees might have caused. And then, strangely, there's been a total silence about the refugees in Germany. There's been almost nothing in the press. And that's why I was particularly delighted that we would have the opportunity to hear Frank talk us through what has actually happened in Germany to those 1.5 million refugees. So with no further ado, Frank.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So the UNHCR published figures yesterday that in the world there are 65 million refugees, either in their own country or displaced in their own country or in another country. Of those 65 million people, 12 million are Syrians, they're the single largest group, and 6.5 million are, if you will, on the run in their own country, and 5.5 million are in neighboring countries or other countries. 3 million are in Turkey alone, and a very large number compared to the size of the country is in Jordan. But then, of course, we also had the refugee migration that started really in 2015 to Europe. And Europe has been a destination, if you will, for refugees for many years. Normally, Europe gets about 200,000 to 300,000 refugees every year across the 28 countries. And Europe had a sizable influx in the mid-90s during the Balkans War, about 2 million on top of that, quite unusual. But then really the 200,000, 300,000. And then in 2015, at the beginning of 2015, this wave started. And this wave has been very unusual for a number of reasons. First of all, refugees normally go to their neighboring country. They don't go far. The boat people are an exception, and there are a few exceptions. Usually they go to a neighboring country, and because most war zones are in poor countries, they end up being in poor neighboring countries. These refugees actually went 3,000 kilometers, so it's very, very unusual. The second thing that was unusual for Europe is the fact that culturally, they're actually fairly distant. So of those 2.5 million people who came since the beginning of 2015, on top of the 200,000 to 300,000 who come every year, a third of them are from Syria, the largest group. Another 25% are from Iraq and Afghanistan, coming very far. And then you have a very large number of African states, people from all over the world, coming, and there's obviously a big crisis potentially brewing of further refugees or migrants from Africa for Europe, and that's happening in the Mediterranean Sea. So this whole thing started to bubble up in 2015, and it was for a long time largely ignored. So there were some warnings from embassies in the Middle East and in Turkey that people were beginning to move, and the Turkish authorities were not stopping them as they usually had. But that was not really noted anywhere significantly, including in Germany until about the summer of 2015, when hundreds of people began to arrive every day. They came through what is now called the Balkan route, through the sea from Turkey to Greece, and then up through the Balkans, through Austria, Hungary, into southern Germany. And you began to see the most amazing scenes in Germany that we hadn't seen for 2 generations. Literally exodus-like scenes where people are walking down the country lanes in the South Bavaria, families with backpacks, people with sort of plastic bags, and lots of young men, of course, just walking down and passing through the train station in Munich. Usually they got picked up by the police and they were not stopped at the border. Germany has a very liberal right of immigration and asylum. It has, in fact, a constitutional and technically unlimited right of asylum, which is one of the political issues. Because of our past, we have that. And so hundreds of people began to pass through the Munich train station every day and were passed on with special trains to other train stations. And German people went to these train stations with paper cardboards saying, welcome. It was really remarkable. So here are these people coming, unexpected. For being honest, we didn't want them to come, but they were largely welcomed. And then this thing began to develop, and in the late August of 2015, we had maybe about 2,000, and then early September, relatively, we had 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 every day. 12,000 people every day. That would be 40 jumbo jets. They're coming by train, but it's a lot of trains. And then the Chancellor did this very amazing thing in a press conference on August 31st, 2015. She said, we can do this. And it was very unusual for her to say that. There hadn't been, as far as I know, anybody is aware, a lot of political debate before that. She thought it was the right thing to do. But in reality, there wasn't much of a strategy at the time. The government did not know exactly what was coming or what was about to happen. And that's very unusual because Chancellor Merkel is not one of those politicians who gamble their fortunes away. We have a few of those. She's a very meticulous politician. There's a reason why she's running for her 4th term in office. She still made this very courageous statement, and then a couple of days later she took a selfie with herself and a Syrian refugee, which went around the world. Many refugees saw it, which may have encouraged more to come. Little remark, the poor refugee has had numerous death threats in the meantime. There are people in Germany who don't like refugees, of course. And supported by lawyers, he's tried to get Facebook to remove the selfie. Facebook has refused. He has sued Facebook, and he lost. So his photo is still out there. So we had the situation that we have literally up to 10,000 people from a relatively different cultural background coming with literally nothing than their clothes, maybe a few backpacks, and typically a mobile phone across the border. And the first thing that happened is that the first stop, if you will, is, of course, you will give people shelter, you will give them something to eat or drink, it's going to be a medical checkup done by the International Red Cross, so lots of volunteering happened. But then the first thing you really need is you need to start the asylum process with these people. Germany is a very civil country, a very civil society, and population expects that we know who's in the country, and of course our police expects to do that. And so the first thing that happened is that the asylum process got completely overwhelmed. Germany is a federal state, so the asylum decisions, which are the basis for all integration, the legal basis for all integration, is at the federal level. Other competencies with regard to refugees are at the state and at the community level, which doesn't make life much easier, by the way. But the Federal Office of Migration got completely overwhelmed, and it was probably overwhelmed already before that. It had trouble dealing with the refugees who had come in the months and years before. The typical asylum process took 5 months. You can really these are not simple decisions, but you can still take them in a couple of days. Yeah? But they took 5 months, and in reality, this average of 5 months included, asylum cases which had been lying around for years. So it was a relatively disorganized part of the Interior Ministry and got completely overwhelmed. The offices that the Federal Office of Immigration maintains in the country were completely unable to deal with 10,000 people coming every day. Literally 1.2 million people came within 15 months. And so this is where we came in, McKinsey and Company, we came in. We were asked together with a few other consultants to work with the Federal Office of Migration and somehow try to speed this up and re-establish order. Yeah? Not law and order, we're not lawyers, but order. And make sure that, people no longer were sitting in facilities for months, not only waiting for their decision, but literally waiting for someone to accept their application, because the applications were piled to the ceiling in the offices of the Federal Office of Migration. And so we went in, and the agency, or the office, became a new head. The head is called Mr. Weise. He was formerly the head of the Employment Agency, and he had masterfully executed the German labor market reforms through the 90s, which have made a big contribution to re-establishing Germany's economic strength. So he was and is a very talented administrator. He was put in charge by the Chancellor. In addition to his other job, by the way, the two agencies are just a mile apart in the city of Nuremberg in Bavaria, just so happens. He asked us to come in, and we looked around, and we realized, well, first of all, we're going to need 10,000 people to do this. We have only 2. We have only 2,000 people. There are only 2 or 2,500 officers at the Federal Office of Migration. So we need another 6 now, 6 or 8 now. These need to be qualified people. They have to take asylum decisions. These are legal decisions. They need to have some legal training. They need to enter the civil service at a certain level to be able to do that. So we came up with a plan to ramp up the personnel, and starting off with asking the civil servants, the ministry, the federal ministries, to designate people to the Federal Office of Migration. The Federal Office of Migration was not the hotbed of successful administrative careers previously, really not. Yeah. So now this was obviously a national emergency, so a lot of people got designated and volunteered. A lot of military people from the German army, German military, volunteered, and so we managed to ramp up the personnel to roughly 10,000 in about 8 or 9 months. The second problem we had is they had a system, an IT system, that you need, of course, and that had a habit of breaking down frequently and could only deal with 3,000 users. Now we needed at least 10,000 users, so we need to stabilize the IT system. The next problem we had is now we have 1.2 million people. The office was never set up for that, so it didn't have the offices around the country to deal with 1.2 million people. 10,000 people coming a day means you'll have buses of refugees coming to these facilities every day. For that, you need to have a facility where people can get off a bus and can safely wait somewhere. And it was getting fall, and Germany has a cold winter. So we opened 26 facilities around the countries, reception centers they were called, to actually deal with this. Since we were kind of the epicenter of the Cold War, we have a lot of military facilities in the country, both from NATO and from Warsaw Pact. They're still around. They were actually extremely helpful, both as shelters, but then also literally to put these facilities in there. So obviously we improved the process. We set up a benchmark process, if you will, that could do this in 48 hours, which was theoretically possible. In reality, processing a asylum application from a complicated country of origin probably takes about a month. Yeah? So we accelerated all of that, and so 21 months later, roughly 1.1 million decisions have been taken, meaning people can either stay or have to leave. Yeah, so that worked. The integration of those people who get to stay has started. The first step of integration is they need to take an integration course, what is called integration, roughly speaking, a language course, Without a language course, without German, it's very hard to live in Germany. It's really not that easy. Of course, many people speak English, but everything is fundamentally in German. And so we doubled the number of integration courses from about 180,000 to 350,000. There were obviously concerns about security. One of the attackers at the Bataclan in Paris was a German refugee living in a facility in Recklinghausen under 5 different identities. Germany has one of the most stringent data privacy and protection laws in the world. It's technically not possible to combine electronic records if they designate individual people. So the law had to be changed. It was changed in February of 2016, took a couple of months of debate, and then was changed. It helps if the government has a sizable majority, so that the various IT systems that both the Federal Office of Migration and the security services maintain could be combined. We introduced if you will, an identity card. In Germany, everybody has an identity card, and everybody is registered somewhere. It's a country where you register in one place, and the place where you register is on your identity cards. Just happens to be the way Germany operates. And so they got an identity card with a fingerprint so that nobody could live under several identities. Otherwise, you could also collect benefits from several places. You could just travel around and collect benefits in several federal states. Nobody would stop you because nobody would find out. Yeah? So we did that. And so 21 months later, still very much at the beginning of integration, and I come back to that, I would say a few things have actually worked relatively well. One thing has worked well. Nobody slept under a bridge in the winter of 2015. We got everybody into housing, sometimes tent cities, but the tents were heated. The construction containers, Germany ran out of construction containers because they're very useful to put people in, and so we got more out of France. Europe is a region with a lot of resources. So everybody had a warm place to sleep. We got through the 1 million asylum decisions in 21 months. What I find most amazing, the level of support from the population and civil society actually held up. Yeah? Of course, this was politically very unpopular. People were not happy. They had not been asked. The approval ratings of the Chancellor nosedived to a level she hadn't seen in a long time. Actually, we have a federal election campaign, just came back to the level before the crisis. But broadly speaking, the support in civil society, tens of thousands of people literally deciding that they want to make a contribution. And I live in the town of Bad Homburg outside Frankfurt. It's a wealthy suburb of Frankfurt. And lots of people who hadn't dreamt of doing this a couple of weeks before literally said, I'm going to distribute clothing in the city. I'm going to go to the facility, I'll distribute clothing, 3 hours every afternoon, whatever I can do. So the support of civil society, tons of volunteering, lots of volunteering, just emerged overnight and held up. Even when we had attacks, several of them. We had a very nasty mass case of sexual harassment in Cologne on New Year's Eve 2015. Nothing much to do with the refugees. These were men who had been, mostly North African men who had been there before, but obviously looks quite similar. We had someone with an axe attacking Chinese tourists on a train, Chinese tourists of all people, in April 2016. And then at Christmas, we had a North African man who had been in the country 2 years drive a truck into one of our Christmas markets, killing a large number of people in Berlin, right in the center of Berlin. In spite of all of that, the support in the country and in civil society has actually held up. And the last thing, and then I come to what's ahead of us, the last thing that has also, I think, worked is we have an election campaign. And one of the reasons why the government was extremely keen to make sure that we get through this whole asylum business, if I may call it that, by the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, is it was always clear there was going to be a federal election on September 24, 2017. We're in the middle of that campaign. And there's a right-wing party called AfD, Alternative for Germany, that gained a lot of support last year and in the meantime lost it. So we have an election campaign that gets fought at the center of the political arena between the Conservative Party and the Social Democrats, and the refugees are actually not a key issue. They're of course an issue, but they're not a key issue. The election campaign is more about equality and other domestic political issues, and of course about what's happening in Europe. So a lot of things have actually worked quite well. However, we are at the beginning of a long journey. So 1.2 million people came, 700,000 get a right to stay. Many of them are war refugees. The right to stay is 3 years, then it gets revisited under the law. If the war ends, presumably people would be asked to go back. But we have about 500,000 who need to go back now already. They can't stay. And they are leaving very slowly. The repatriation or returns, as I would rather call it, is in the authority of the federal states. And some of them have been faster and some of them have been slow, but generally the process has been slow. And then, of course, integration into the labor market is just beginning. People have to take language courses first. They have to pass them with a level called B2, which is actually not that low. The threshold for that is not that low, so many refugees don't get there. We have people coming from Syria, from Africa, from Iraq, from Afghanistan. The Syrians are generally relatively well educated. Syria used to be a socialist country. Socialist countries educate their children well, including the girls. So they all go to school. They've all been at school. The Iraqi people often have a different background. Some of the people from Afghanistan have very little educational attainment. And so it's going to take years to get them into some education that is the basis for being a productive member of society and work. So that's just starting. The German labor market is one that works on the basis of qualifications for which you have a certificate. You can say that's silly, but that's the way it is. It's not enough to be a doctor and engineer. You have to have a piece of paper that says you are a doctor under German law and you are an engineer recognized. And so these qualifications have to get recognized, which is not always easy, particularly if there are language issues. And then you have jobs in some of the countries of origin that don't exist. So you have people who had maybe a little shop or worked in a shop in a bazaar. That's not how retailing works in Germany. This job doesn't exist. It will never exist. So there are many, many issues to come. Germany has successfully integrated immigrants before. When the wall fell, we had a lot of immigrants from China who were ethnic Germans. Now they were ethnic Germans. That's easy. We had what was called guest workers, not a great term, but that's what it was called in the 60s and 70s, a couple of million from Portugal, from Italy, and from Turkey. They have actually been well integrated. They are mostly second generation, third generation, mostly Germans now. So we've done this before, but still these are people who are we didn't recruit, who don't come with a lot of qualification or any. We have a lot of young men. We have minors. We have restricted in the meantime their ability to then bring their family. Depending on the refugee title you get, you either can or cannot bring your family. There was a lot of political pressure that the young men would not be able to bring their direct family because then you get the next huge number. And so the jury is completely out where this will in the end go. Early on, people were saying, isn't it wonderful, all these Syrian doctors are now coming and we're going to send them to the countryside where the German medical students, once they have their exam, don't want to go. That's, of course, all nonsense. But over time, I'm sure they will, they will assume qualifications. Qualifications will get recognized, but it's a long, long journey. It costs the taxpayer about 20 billion a year, which at the moment Germany has a fiscal surplus because the finance minister pays 0 or negative interest rates on debt. Very helpful. So the 20 billion are a fiscal stimulus at the moment. There's no big debate about the 20 billion, and the construction industry has been happy. Many other services have been happy. But clearly this is a huge investment. And as I said, the jury is still very much out how successful this will in the end be. One thing I can say, it certainly did not fail early on.
So when Mrs. Merkel said we can do this, was she right?
I think the translation actually, she said, wir schaffen das. It means it's a mixture between we can do this and we should do this. It basically means we're going. Yeah? Germany is a rich country with 85 million people. We have integrated refugees before. We should absolutely be able to do this. There's no question why we wouldn't. We have a labor market with the lowest unemployment in 30 years. We have a demographic issue that we know of that the refugees aren't technically the answer to, but still we have it. Yeah? It's not the kind of immigration we would have chosen to have, but now we have it. And I think we can absolutely make the best of it. I think the trick is that we maintain the societal consensus, which is largely there, not at the extremes, but largely there, that somehow we can do this, and that we are able to either return them or ask them to return to their home countries, or turn them into productive members of society. But as I said, that will take many years to come.
Thank you, Frank. Let me take your questions to Frank. And Gayles, did you have a question to kick off? So do we have a microphone? Do introduce yourself, Gayles.
Thank you very much. My name is Gayles. I'm a student here at Blavatnik, originally from Israel. So one of the main themes in the last couple of days was the tension between the local and the global, I will say the big and the small. And it seems like today citizens face more and more institutions that are big, complicated, and distant. Either it's whether it's voters in Louisiana, how they feel about the federal government and the corporate media, or how we feel many times towards the big tech companies like Facebook and Uber, and not to talk about banks and pharmaceuticals and so on. And it seems like a lot of the themes we discussed have to do with this sense of distance from the forces that shape our life. It makes people feel more confused about their identity, about their place in the world, maybe even lonely to some extent. And I think mainly it makes them feel that they don't have an impact on what's going on around them. So my question is very practical. What do you think we can practically do to give people a sense that they can make an impact on the communities around them?
Well, I would say this is actually, this whole, the way I told the story, the way I personally see it, is actually a fairly optimistic story. Yeah? And certainly not one of disaster at all. People were not excited when in an empty hospital or military facility in their community, all of a sudden 800 refugees sit, who don't speak a word of the language. And that's not necessarily what you are really excited about in the beginning. But I think people react, and that's where, they were, the refugees are distributed around the German federal state using a key, literally a distribution, that is used for subsidizing the country, the federal states among each other, called Königsteiner Schlüssel. It's the only key that the federal states in Germany, the 16 of them, have ever been able to agree on. And so there was no way, it was clear we're going to use that one. And nothing else exists. And so people get distributed from the south of the country where everybody arrived to other places. And now all of a sudden they sit in your community, maybe in eastern Germany on the Baltic Sea, right, which is far away from the southern border. And quite similar. The decision was taken, people on the ground were not asked, the communities were not asked, the federal states decide who goes where. Yeah? But still people, and of course that created resistance, and we have attacks on refugee facilities, and we have right-wing people, which we had before, by the way. We have all that. But by and large, as I said, the civil society rose to the occasion. And I think that's actually, in the spirit of this conference, an optimistic note. Yeah? It's not perfect at all, yeah? But by and large, people volunteered in all kinds of different ways. People created platforms, people created courses, people literally just distributed shoes and clothing and whatever. So a lot of people decided to somehow make a contribution to this. And so what I would take from that to your question is, I don't think necessarily that this is always the big state talking down at the small citizen. I think, it's of course a question of how it gets communicated and how it gets done. But I think there are many instances where civil society actually does take the challenge positively, and not only the people who go to NGO meetings, they're just normal people. Yeah? And this is one of those examples.
Now, I've got a flurry of people. I'm just going to ask you each to make a brief comment. I'm going to collect up 5 that have already indicated to me they'd like to make a comment. And then I'd like to come to Senator Feingold for his reflection. And I'd also like to come to Olly Hochschild, because it struck me in the preparation of this conference. I had a long conversation with Olly about strangers in their own land in the United States. How do you integrate the people that feel left behind? And then a long conversation with Frank about literally strangers in this land of Germany and how you integrate them into Germany. And it struck me that there were some themes in what looked like very different situations that might even weave together. But let's go through. So, Karthik.
Yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. I mean, just to see. Oh, thank you. This is absolutely fantastic. Just to see, as you say, a success story of efficient public delivery, and that it's really such a wonderful note to end the conference on. My question is really about whether there is a need here now to give these individuals a sense of ownership in society, in their new society, because you've spoken of sort of their admittance being term limited, and that of course makes all kinds of pragmatic sense. But if the goal is really to have some sort of buy-in into German identity, German values, when and how do you think about endowing them with ownership rights in society?
Thank you, Karthik. Olly, you had a comment?
Olly Blake, MPP, student here at Blavatnik. Continuing on from Karthik's question, Prince Charles was one of the earliest people in the UK to link some of the problems we're having with terrorism in the country, with bad housing, lack of integrated housing, lack of cross-community sports interaction, and generally not enough catalysts for mixing communities. So I'm just curious, as part of the McKinsey's crisis consultancy, as well as solving the short-term problem, were you asked to look onto the horizon as to how you might solve problems further down the line?
Thank you. While you're there, Aida has a comment.
Hello, Aida, MPP student. I was myself a refugee in Germany, and I had really positive experience as a refugee there. What I've experienced actually as a returnee is a rather challenging one. And I'm not the only one. So it's kind of, as a refugee, you live there in a certain country and a culture, and then you're supposed at one moment to go back. And it's kind of what I think was missing, or is still missing today, is a kind of a preparation of people to go back to their home countries and how they, to teach them how they can participate in their state building of their own societies.
Thank you. Mary. Yeah.
Mary Angen, I'm a postdoc at the Blavatnik School. Actually, my question kind of builds on what Ida asked. As far as I know, vast majority of the guest workers of 16s and 70s actually decided to stay in Germany. I mean, part of the reason is probably they also wanted to send remittances back home. Or in some cases, they just actually felt Germany was their new home. At the end of the day, it's you actually adapt yourself to your new environment. So if that is the case with the refugees of today, I wonder how the society is going to be ready to absorb such a large number of refugees. And well, I mean, economically, it's a different question. Maybe in the long run, it wouldn't be a problem. But what could be done to avoid what happened with, let's say, the Turkish immigrants who, in a way, formed their own ghettos in parts of Berlin? And, well, the new generation does speak the language, but the first generation actually did struggle a lot in a way, adapting to their new environment. So, thank you.
Thank you. And across to here, this gentleman.
Ken Troutman, DIW Berlin. I was wondering if, if you look at the experiences of other rich countries who have experienced similarly composed refugee influxes, such as Denmark and Sweden and Finland, it does not lead one to be very optimistic about the prospects for integration. So I was wondering, what kind of lessons have you worked with those governments? What kind of lessons have you tried to glean from their experiences in integrating, and the things they did wrong and things that you could do right?
And then a last comment. Elizabeth, you had one. Back row. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Elizabeth Roberts, Weidenfeld Scholarship Program. That was an immensely heartening story. I think we all felt impressed and touched by it. But I wonder, Germany has a very distinctive history. I mean, there are certain features about Germany, including the integration of Eastern Germany, people from Eastern Germany. You mentioned identity cards. Other countries don't always have this. I wonder if there are particular lessons read across that you can see applying in other countries, or is this a particularly German success story?
Great. So, Frank, I mean, lots of the questions are around similar themes, but I wonder if you could sort of just briefly touch on.
I'll try to. I would say, first of all, in terms of how do you make sure that you don't get what we call parallel societies? Yeah, that's the term we use in Germany, and we have a little bit of that in places like Berlin and a few cities in the Ruhr district. Where communities of immigrants have assembled. And that's not per se bad. I think that's a natural mechanism. You go to your community, you go where, relatives may live. That's totally normal. The only problem, you get a problem the moment when they don't integrate into the rest of society. They don't speak the language. And we have a few pockets of that, but very few. I mean, no comparison to the banlieues of Paris or even some of the things you would see in the UK. And obviously the numbers are smaller. But at the same time, the trick is to create communities of refugees. They will naturally somehow flock together, and every country has kind of a different city. It's not always Berlin. And encourage integration, encourage communication. It's not so easy. Somebody asked about the leadership of these communities. The refugees per se don't have a leadership. That's one of the unusual things. You get 1 million people, there's no structure. Now, normally, somebody is somehow in charge, but that was completely absent. And the 1 million is also very diverse. So they're not even all from one country. And they get distributed for administrative reasons across the 16 countries, and then some of them resettle. So one of the issues is community leadership. Many of them are Muslims. My personal impression is, I'm not an expert on this, but my impression is the Muslim community has not done as much as it could to embrace all the Islamic refugees. Yeah, most of the Islamic communities are Turkish, and they have a very strong sense of identity. They have a lot of issues with their own president, and we have a lot of issue with their president, and we also have a lot of issues with at least some of the Turkish community representatives, how they interact with the Turkish government. We're not, I would say, generally not very happy, or we could be happier, let me put it like this. Yeah. So I think there is absolutely an issue about representation. There was for a while what I personally thought, and much of what I'm saying here is my personal view and not McKinsey's view, what I personally thought a very unhealthy debate about whether Germany is a Christian or an Islamic country or both. And that has the potential to be extremely divisive. We also have debates about whether religious symbols can be shown at school. We have had and have debates about headscarves and whether you can wear them at the workplace. The answer is no. Whether you can wear them as a teacher or as a pupil, the answer is again generally no. So there have been lawsuits about this. And I think that's a very unhealthy debate because, of course, Germany is a Christian country in my view, but we do have a couple of million Islamic people from various religions within Islam. Yeah? And so it doesn't help us to talk about the values. When people take the so-called integration course, of course they get told about the Christian values of the country that are embedded in our constitution. Yeah, you have to know them, you have to respect them, otherwise we have a lot of problems. But that doesn't mean you can't be, doesn't mean at all you can't have a different religion, you can't practice a different religion, you can't have very different beliefs. So in many ways, I think it's an unhealthy debate, and we should avoid it because it serves only one purpose: it pits people against each other. Yeah? And at the end of the day, I think, of course, people need to embrace the liberal values that we have. They need to embrace our constitution. They need to abide by the law in all its many facets in Germany. But then it's a free country. Yeah.
And what are the lessons you've been able to draw from other countries? Are there positive examples in other countries?
I would say there's probably, this was a very unusual situation because of the structure and the size and the magnitude of the immigration. Sweden had experienced something like this a couple of years earlier. And we as a firm at Literary also work with the Swedish government. And Sweden is a very liberal country that has traditionally been very open to immigration and refugees. By the way, Sweden took the second largest group of refugees. The refugees want to go to, I mean, they come to Germany because they want to go to Germany, and they come to Sweden because they want to go to Sweden. It's obviously a rich country with a good social safety net. So I think there are lessons from there. One of the lessons from there that we took, and I would again say the jury is out, it is very important that you maintain the rule of law, and so if the law says somebody can stay, they stay. If the law says somebody needs to go, they need to go. And in my personal view, the German population expects that. And the Swedish government has struggled with this for many reasons. You're returning people to their home country, you're giving them maybe incentives to return to their home country, which is not popular in an election year. You pay them literally. Or you put people on planes. You will put some people on planes who have lived in the country for 15 years and their children are at school. And so in every one of these cases, you can make many arguments why they should stay. And of course, the civil liberty people in Germany make that case, and they go to court rightfully. You have access to the legal system. But still, I think it is very important that we not only accept people, we not only try to make them productive members of society, but where the decision is under the law, because that's the only thing we stand on. And we can disagree with the law, but it's still the only thing we stand on. Under the law, they cannot stay. We need to find ways to make them go home. And that doesn't mean to put them on planes under armed guard. That's a small minority. Almost the overwhelming majority has to leave and will leave voluntarily. Everything else is unthinkable.
Thank you, Frank. Let me move to Senator Russ Feingold. The problem with the refugees, the problem of the strangers in their own land are sharp ends of a problem I think every one of our societies is facing, which is how do you integrate different communities within countries, sometimes communities that have lived side by side for centuries. How do we ensure they're integrated? It's very interesting, by the way, that one country that does this scientifically is Singapore. Every single housing that is, first, we have good psychological evidence that it's very important that people are integrated in their housing and schools, because otherwise communities become more and more fearful and less likely to interact. In Singapore, it's fascinating, the government-provided housing is allocated strictly according to quotas of the ethnic minorities in the population, so that there is a kind of state-regulated integration project right there in the housing. But Senator Feingold.
First, let me just say how, even though my comments don't relate to it, how privileged I feel to have heard this account, this balanced account of what Germany has done here. I mean, it's an admirable thing for the whole world to see, and particularly for us in the United States, who have sadly seen this issue so simplistically politicized. So I just was moved by hearing about it, and will want to know more. I want to thank the Blavatnik School of Government for allowing me to be a late entry into the conference and even letting me speak. Dean Woods, thank you. I also want to thank you for giving me a respite for the as we say in America, the 24/7 experience of talking about Donald Trump. And people laugh, but it is a problem. It is devastating to simply social relations. And I'm not talking about if somebody's having an argument with somebody. I'm just saying trying to stay away from the topic. My favorite piece on this was, of all places, in the religion section of the Washington Post. It was entitled, "I'm giving up Trump for Lent. Here's how." So it's a pleasure to be at a conference that's talking about, you know, some of these trends internationally. It's not just about one person, and that's something Americans have to remember. And I apologize that my remarks are rather USA-centric, but, you know, my notes that I've taken gave me a lot of food for thought in the last 2 days about how this affects the United States. And the first thing I want to note is the importance of getting this term populism right. I remember yesterday Mr. Chatterjee saying that in India the term capitalism has got problems, connotation problems. Well, for me and for many of us from the sort of the Midwest, the term populism has a positive connotation. In my state of Wisconsin, it was the progressive movement that grew out of the populist era, fighting the robber barons. That's the foundation of my political philosophy and of much good. My state was the first to come up with unemployment compensation, child labor laws. It invented Social Security before it became at the University of Wisconsin. So obviously populism sometimes has had a horrific impact. But I think the point is populism occurs when people feel the government is not or no longer on the level, or it's rigged, or it's illegitimate in some way. And populism can be a check on the faults of the elites, as was done with the progressive era, and as Professor Fung very effectively talked about yesterday, maybe it's academic elites. Whatever it is, there is a potential for correction. And I would argue, in the spirit of Professor Hochschild, who says when you feel how you feel positioned in the world, part of how you feel positioned in the world is that you believe that you have an equal part in that government. And when you feel that's been taken away from you, that is one of the things that affects your feeling about your position in the world. You know, this conference did not shrink from assessing responsibility for government for some of these problems, the legitimacy problem, whether it's Brexit here or the U.S. elections, whether it's the EU or the United States Congress seeming compromised that leads to this kind of populism. And from my perspective in the United States, this isn't only about conservative white angry males. There are others who are at least unhappy, and we need to remember that's part of this. The millennials express this extremely well in their massive support for Bernie Sanders. There is a suspicion that the process is not on the level. In fact, I want to add to the conversation, because there was not a lot about this. It isn't just about the United States, but to get a complete picture. What I have seen since 2009 and 2010 is a direct assault on some of the basic governmental institutions of the United States from the right in areas that were never disputed. The first is the attack on the right to vote, which Brian Stevenson brilliantly discussed this morning in one context, which is the ability of felons to vote, but gerrymandering, requiring voter IDs to vote. This is something no politician would have wanted to have anything to do with 15 years ago, Republican or Democrat. Now it is the way to try to win elections. The second was alluded to at length yesterday by Ms. Buckingham, who said that the issue of huge money in politics, the lack of rules in campaign finance, is an enormous drag on people's view that their vote counts the same as other people's. And in fact, when we did the exercise with the ideas, with the war cloud, that issue of money in politics, I thought was fairly prominent. A third, frankly, is a very old item that I think has been illegitimate for a long time, and that's our electoral college system in the United States. We're always lecturing other countries about how you should adopt certain rules, and we have this bizarre system that was grounded in slavery and the 3/5 man rule that Brian Stevenson talked about, giving states that had slaves a greater chance to win the presidency. We now have had 2 out of the last 3 presidents become president, even though they didn't get a plurality of the votes. This is deeply troubling to almost anyone's sense of fairness if they look at it objectively, and needs to be changed. And finally, something that I feel very strongly about is the theft of the United States Supreme Court. Where's the legitimacy of having Donald Trump fill a seat on the Supreme Court after people worked so hard and won with Barack Obama? It was his right to fill that seat. It isn't about who the guy was. I might have voted for him if I was a senator in a normal situation. It was that they broke the norm. They broke the bipartisan understanding that you would not delay an appointment for all those years. So my point is here that there is a sense in both the right and the left that the government has lost some of its legitimacy. So where do we go from here? Well, obviously hundreds of ideas have come up. But one has to be doing something about money in politics. The Citizens United decision blew away those laws that were passed in that progressive era that I just talked about, that prevented corporations from giving unlimited contributions to politics. The way I explain it to people who don't want to hear all the legalities is, until 2010, if you bought a tube of toothpaste, that money couldn't be used for a political campaign. Everything you buy, everything you do, can be thrown into the pot for politics. And this has caused people to feel that their role, their $10 contribution, whatever it might be, has no meaning. In fact, I'm even possibly thinking about Swati Ramanathan's I paid a bribe for our campaign contributors. You know, all these very wealthy people should be given that opportunity to go to an app and say, I paid a bribe. These politicians called me up and said, I need $500,000, I need $1 million, exposing what is going on, which is now hidden, because those campaign contributions are largely hidden from the public. A second idea, which we didn't talk a lot about because maybe it's more of an American problem, but encouraging bipartisanship, encouraging multipartisanship, encouraging nonpartisanship. When I first ran for office in Wisconsin for state senate, I noticed that people became immediately turned off if you mentioned political party. They understood that when you ran for office, you have to have a party, but their expectation was the day you were sworn in, then you would work together. And the best experience I had as a senator was something called the McCain-Feingold bill, which was an 8-year effort to do something about campaign finance with, obviously, a Republican Senator John McCain. This has been stopped in its tracks since the Tea Party emerged in 2010. And why? It's because, as one of the earlier speakers today pointed out, you may want to have politicians who are high-minded and have all the right values, but the truth is most politicians, almost all, what they care about is, will they be reelected? That's the bottom line. I've had those feelings myself at various moments. But the problem became, when the Tea Party came in, is they sent a very effective message, which is if you work with Democrats, you are what they called a rhino, which means a Republican in name only. And so when I point out that Lindsey Graham was working with John Kerry on climate change, it was all he's just a rhino. And they delivered. They got rid of Richard Lugar, one of the most internationalist, progressive Republican senators. They got rid of other people. And so there's become a disincentive in that regard. And finally, the thing I was most encouraged by, perhaps, was the constant talk about, and including in the war cloud, engagement by government with people. When I was a United States Senator, I went to every one of Wisconsin's 72 counties every year and held a town meeting. And sometimes it was rough, sometimes it was fun, but it was always in the spirit that whether it's a crisis, a fire, a hurricane, or whatever, but also just on a day-to-day basis, people need to have that kind of access. And it also has to involve the internet and all the potentials there. I think you need both. And so I can see that the time is elapsing. So let me just say that what I think this all does is if we can restore some of these values. I don't think people expect certain outcomes. I don't think they expect to win every time. But they expect that the game is not rigged. And that is the key.
Fantastic. Can you join me in thanking Senator Feingold, and Frank Mattern for just an illuminating session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And now, in just closing today, I'm not going to sum up the conference, but what I would like to do just before you all head home, and one of my favorite things about these conferences is to hear people say that the idea they're taking home or the solution they think they'll apply, very much as Senator Feingold just did. But what I thought I'd do is just mention the things that I think were unexpected that we heard over the last day and a half. You know, what's unexpected, particularly for a school of government that's focused on evidence and big ideas and at this moment in the world. And there's been an arc to the conference. So we started with capitalism. And I think what was unexpected for me was the sense that actually it's very recently that capitalism veered sharply off course and became so short-term. That it's just in the last decade that the structure of capital, of shareholding, and of leadership in the private sector has suddenly become much more short-term. And that some of the big beasts out there, right, the largest asset manager in the world, BlackRock, combining its forces with Tata and Unilever and McKinsey's, have found it extremely difficult to do any course correction. So I think that was a real challenge that we began with. But people are doing things about that, and I think that took us into the next session. Moved us more into the political terrain, and I think the unexpected part of this was simply put this morning. It's hard to do the right thing, right? It's actually hard to do the courageous thing. That getting it right and doing it right is very often not convenient and comfortable. And yet, people really are. And we heard about them and saw them and heard them during the conference. So Swati's I Paid a Bribe, which has inspired a lot of you and shows the way that citizens can actually act to try to create course corrections. Tuli Madonsela and her discharge of the office of the public protector reminded us that across so many of the countries here, lawyers, judges have been doing their thing. In Brazil, it's been judges and lawyers that have been sort of leading a crusade against corruption. Likewise, in Italy, they did the same. In South Africa, Brian Stevenson's work, that there are, whether it's citizens or lawyers and judges, there are ways to course correct which lie within the system, but neither in the economy nor in the political system. To me, a third unexpected tale is that in a world with so much data and so much evidence of the kind of 100,000 pages kind, what really matters is storytelling and narratives. The town hall, the story, the thing that evokes empathy in people. And we heard a lot about that. Frank Mattern's story of Germany is a really important one. Teresa Reno Weber talked about how important it is for government officials to hear about their own successes, to see them, to see the stories on the ground. We forget that to do a job really well, you need morale, you need inspiration, you need to know and feel that you're making a difference. And too often, we expect people who are working for government to be doing their best locked in an airless office without ever seeing the product of their result. And so all they read about are the failures, and they're not buoyed up and given confidence and morale by the successes. And it was lovely to hear successes through these days. But in the storytelling, I think both Olly and Brian reminded us of the importance of what Olly called the deep story. Like not thinking that our interpretation of the story is right, but rather seeking to see the story as it's been lived by somebody else. So be careful of these notions of post-truth and emotive politics, because sometimes I think that's used as a way to discard what to another person is the reality of their experience. To me, a fourth sort of unexpected was, Amazon delivery sounds great. It's in 2 hours. It's in a package. It's what you ordered. And there are parts of government that's great to have. Passports, filing your tax returns, make government seamless and as easy as it is to buy things. But I think the surprise was how limited the application of that is to all the other things that government does. So it was Bob Klitgaard's challenge that actually in the United States, there's only 7% of government expenditure that goes on those kinds of service delivery. What about the other 93% of expenditure where we can't rely on that kind of consumer relationship to deliver great government? On great government, to me, the surprise was sitting in one of the seminar rooms with a panel of 5 performance gurus and to have them all agree that they wanted to ban the phrase, as Kate Joseph said, ban the phrase, what gets measured gets done. Now, let's be careful with this. They're not saying don't measure. They're not saying don't have targets. I think what I took from that discussion was a very nuanced sense that Nana, the head of Ghana's civil service, captured, that you can't rely on periodic measures to do the job of management. There's a nice analogy that's being used in some management quarters of, performance. That when we think about performance, we shouldn't think annual appraisals, bonuses, and KPIs. We should think of ballet school, where you're constantly being corrected with accurate, specific feedback, and where in every minute of the class you're getting better. And so to me, what I took from that session was that we shouldn't rely on crude indicators when we've got much better ways to encourage better performance. And finally, I think it was Nana's observation as head of the Ghanaian civil service that there are lots of big transformative ideas, big projects. Most of the public policy space is consumed with how do we scale this up? How do we do things at scale? And his simple message that actually it's small things that really matter. That it's getting the small things right, whether it's punctuality or, again, the small parts of behavior. It reminded me of the precept that runs right through my family, which is you must leave every place you visit or inhabit a little bit better. If you're in a committee meeting, if you're in the school, if you're in a public toilet, what every single one of us should have is a sense that you should leave it just a little better than when you arrived. And that's a small thing that amplified creates huge kind of transformative change. I think in closing, we've all been reminded in every session that proximity matters. And that's challenging for a school that is global and that's looking at government. Because global is big scale and government is big scale. And it's, Gal, the challenge that you put in your question. Because the challenge is to take those big scale problems and big scale solution finding exercises and to think about how we bring proximity to them. The voice of those least likely to be yelling in our ear, the voice of those least likely to be filing lawsuits against us, the voice of those who government actually affects the most, either through its justice or its injustice. And so that's to me the challenge, that it's one of many challenges, but it's a really serious challenge for us all to take away. I think as a school we'll take it away to think about how we educate, how we do our research, how we do advocacy in our research. So those are just my thoughts about some of the unexpected things. I hope you've all got your own. And it remains just for me to say a huge thank you for coming, for giving us your time and sharing your thoughts and experience with us. We will certainly be emailing you probably in the next 10 minutes to ask you, not the usual survey, please. We're not sending you a long survey, but we're just asking you, as we think about making this conference better for all of you next year, what should we keep doing? What should we do differently? And we'd love your feedback on that. But just before I close, I've thanked you all. I've thanked our speakers. But can I give heartfelt thanks from me and from all of you to the amazing Blavatnik School team who have been behind the scenes making all of this so smooth. Jonathan Cheng, Callum Miller, Jody, Ava. I shouldn't start naming people because there's so many in the team. Matt, and the IT team, those who have been working on reception and greeting you and feeding you and just making the conference seamless. Can we give a huge round of applause to them? Safe travels and thanks.